I want to welcome everyone to today's event, Taking Olmstead into the Future, an evolving vision of community integration for people with disabilities. My name is Kristen Clarke, and it's my pleasure as the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division at the United States Department of Justice to celebrate the anniversary of the Olmstead decision with all of you who are here. We are delighted that you joined us to reflect on this critical moment in the history of the disability rights movement and to consider how the vision of community integration has evolved over time, including new civil rights challenges as we move forward. In a few moments, I will ask our esteemed panelists, Estelle Richman, the former Secretary of Public Welfare for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and Keris Myrick, the co-director of the Mental Health Strategic Impact Initiative, to share their thoughts on the impact of Olmstead and talk a bit about their own disability rights advocacy and work. But before we begin that discussion, I want to share just a few words about the decision and the Justice Department's work in this area. As many of you know, 23 years ago, the Supreme Court decided Olmstead versus Elsie, holding that the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits the unnecessary segregation of people with disabilities in institutions. The Justice Department's ADA regulations also provide that state and local governments must administer services to people with disabilities in the most integrated setting appropriate. Enforcement of this integration mandate has literally helped thousands of people with disabilities across our country to live, work, and receive services in their homes and communities instead of in institutions or other segregated settings. And the decision has also allowed them to have greater independence, autonomy, and opportunities to participate fully in their communities. While early cases focused on the segregation of people with disabilities in state-run institutions, the integration mandate has been applied also to segregated work settings for people with disabilities and segregated schools and classrooms for children with disabilities. Increasingly, the vision for community integration includes how criminal justice systems and disability service systems must work together to prevent the needless institutionalization and incarceration of people with disabilities. The Civil Rights Division has played a central role in enforcing the integration mandate and continues to play this role today. Just a few days ago, the division concluded an investigation into complaints of needless segregation in Maine, finding that the state unnecessarily institutionalizes children with mental health disabilities and intellectual and developmental disabilities in psychiatric hospitals, residential treatment facilities, and a juvenile justice facility instead of providing them with community-based services. Last month, the division entered into a settlement agreement with Rhode Island, requiring the state to modify its policies so that children with intellectual and developmental disabilities will receive community-based services that they are authorized to receive. Also in May, the division opened an investigation into whether Kentucky unnecessarily segregates people with serious mental illness in the Louisville, Jefferson County metro area in psychiatric hospitals and places them at risk of law enforcement encounters by failing to provide integrated community-based mental health services needed to avoid these results. And these are just a few recent examples of all of the important work that the attorneys in our disability rights section and special litigation section have done, some in partnership with U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, to combat the needless institutionalization and segregation of people with disabilities. With that background, I want to go ahead and introduce our guests, Estelle and Keris, and bring them into the conversation. Estelle Richman is one of the pioneers of community integration. In her roles running Philadelphia's mental health system and later serving as Pennsylvania's Secretary of Public Welfare, she implemented closures of state psychiatric hospitals, including the Philadelphia State Hospital, which was notorious for its history of inhumane conditions as well as other institutions. She went on to serve as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, among other roles. She's a nationally recognized expert on behavioral health and other disability services. And she's also focused on how service systems can better meet the needs of communities of color. Keris Myrick is a co-director of the Mental Health Strategic Impact Initiative. She brings years of experience as an advocate, a director of a large peer support services organization, a federal government official directing the Consumer Affairs Office within the Center for Mental Health Services, and more. She's also a person with a psychiatric disability who has firsthand lived experience with mental health service systems and firsthand experience with the use of police to respond to mental health crises. Estelle and Keris, thank you so much for being here today. I want to go ahead and pose my first question to Estelle. Estelle, you've spent decades advancing the rights of people with disabilities, and you were one of the very first pioneers of community integration, long before the Supreme Court decided the Olmstead case. Let's talk a little bit about what brought you to that work.
Well, I have to say that I probably had it a little bit in my DNA. My mother and father and their brothers and sisters were all strong advocates for civil rights. My father, grandfather, and uncle were a doctor. One of my uncles was part of the plaintiff group that argued the Brown versus the Board of Education. So I very much grew up knowing an awful lot about rights. And what I learned, since I grew up in a very segregated environment in Virginia, was that second-class citizenship was not okay. My early memories were that people, Black people in the South, were not represented at any policy table. They did not have rights on the school board, city council, housing, or healthcare. And I think at that point, I learned that people whose, when policies are being discussed, if that policy is going to impact your life, you have a right to be at that table. And I sort of vowed to myself then, if I ever got into a position where I was at a policy table, I would find ways to make sure whoever's life was going to be impacted, I had them or their representative, but hopefully them at my policy table. And fortunately, I've been able to do that, but that has helped me sustain during this long battle.
It is fascinating to hear that you've got an uncle who worked on Brown versus Board of Education. I know that that was the case that came out of South Carolina. So
and he was from South Carolina.
Yeah. Well, let's pivot and talk about the very important work, the movement that you led that led to the eventual closure of the Philadelphia State Hospital. And I'm hoping that for our participants, you can paint a bit of a picture of what it was like being institutionalized inside that hospital.
Well, and that's the perfect place to start. When I first visited Philadelphia State Hospital, and this would have been late 1987, 1988, when we started the closure, the only thing you could say is it was deplorable. People sat around, sometimes partially clothed, frequently nothing to do, very disenfranchised, pacing the floor, or over-medicated. So they just sat dazed. But it had been described as a snake pit in one of the movies, and places that you would never want someone to be or someone to live. And the closure that was announced by the governor, and let me give a shout out to Governor Casey at that time, because he really did have the political will to make the decision. There had been a blue ribbon committee that had recommended the closure of Philadelphia State Hospital. And he made the decision, and it's a memorable date because it was December 7th, 1987, when he made the decision that the hospital would close. It was interesting at that point because one of the security guards that was saying goodbye to the Blue Ribbon Committee after their last committee said, "We'll see you in 5 years." Because the plans to close that hospital had been made 2 to 3 times before then. Yet it had always been changed. People get a little bit of political heat. They object to a closure, and the hospital continues to exist. This time, the governor said, "We are going to close Philadelphia State Hospital," incidentally known to anyone from Philadelphia as Byberry, and there would be no way to keep it open. I have to give a shout out to Marty Nicely. Marty and I both came from Ohio, a couple of months before I did, and we made a commitment that the hospital would not just be a traditional closure. We would try to make sure everyone in the hospital, and there were approximately 300 people, would be moved to the community and not to another institution. It was fairly frequent if a hospital closed, you just picked everyone up and you moved them to a different institution, and they continue to be institutionalized. We were committed that people would be allowed to move directly to the community and provide its supports, from case management to housing to things to do during the day to a social life, but they would live in the community with supports. And we wanted that for 100% of the people who were at that time in the hospital. I think overall, we ended up moving approximately, I think about 5 people out of the 300 ended up going to another type of institution. But vastly, we were able to get people in the community. Some of them took a little longer than others, but I think within 2.5 years, we'd actually accomplished that goal. But it couldn't have been done without, obviously, an awful lot of support. And I take that back again to the governor and John White, who was the Secretary of Public Welfare at that point in time. What made that, though, an amazing closure and a great learning lesson for everyone connected was not only did we commit to moving people to the community, we had 2 other things working in our favor. One, we were able to split the population into 2 conceptual groups. One was that we would find housing and supports for individualized for everyone who was at that time in the hospital. And the second half was that we would plan for the people who would have gone to the hospital if it had remained open. Because often where communities fall down is they may plan for the people there, but there would have been just as many who would have gone into that hospital that also had to have housing and supports if they were going to live successfully and not be in a hospital. So our commitment was to change Philadelphia in such a way that people lived community-based if they were coming out, and they were lived community-based in case they would need a hospital. The third feature was that the governor promised that the money that was going in to support the hospital at that point in time would be moved to the community. At that point in time, there was $40 million that supported Philadelphia State Hospital. And to everyone's surprise, and mine too, the governor moved $40 million to Philadelphia. You can create a system of care when you have the money to do it. And we learned a lot. But what we learned is if you have housing and supports and you have a backup of the community, you can have everybody be successful living in the community.
So my guess is that your uncle probably took on a lot of resistance while carrying out his work in the courts during the civil rights movement. And I'm guessing that you also took on a lot of resistance, people who were probably deeply skeptical about the work that you were doing. So maybe talk with us a little bit about how you addressed the concerns that were raised about transitioning people from state hospitals into community living.
I would tell you that it was twofold. One, in the very beginning, no one really believed it would close. It had been announced before, so the immediate opposition wasn't there because everybody thought, oh, this too will pass. But there was a lot of skepticism, and particularly from families who were concerned that some people would obviously get discharged, and they were very apprehensive. I would say your traditional groups that were often skeptical. The hospital administrations thought they were going to be overwhelmed. Many of the community agencies really weren't looking forward to this. And certainly the hospital staff at all levels were absolutely opposed. But they too thought it wouldn't happen. I think as I got into the Philadelphia activity, learned more about the system, and we began to talk to everyone, anyone who wanted a meeting at any level, we were there to talk with them. I met with staff at every shift at the hospital, probably about once a week. We met with legislators. Their interest is different. Theirs was all about were people going to get jobs? How many people were you going to lay off? Or what happened to those people? So everyone had a slightly different but very self-centered take on what would happen with the closure. And we were careful to make sure that we had and met with them frequently enough that we could keep people updated as we moved. We worked very hard to make sure people had jobs. Out of all of this, only 19 people ended up not having a job and were laid off, which was incredible. But the governor had opened up the entire state system for placement within the area so people could find jobs. So that took off. The legislators were very concerned that there would be, they would either have constituents without jobs or there would be the NIMBY impact, and we would put housing in places they didn't want it. That was one that we really did have to deal with because we were determined to have housing in communities, not just shoved off into a commercial area. So we did talk with them a lot. Although we did not seek their permission, we did keep them informed. Probably one of the ways that we kept people very active was to hold frequent communities forums around what we were doing, how it was going to take. We met with frequently with the advocates to make sure they knew what we were doing. We met with psychiatrists, we met with communities. We met with just about everybody who wanted a meeting, and sometimes with people who didn't particularly want a meeting, to make sure they understand what we were doing. At the same time, we did find out that many of the mental health agencies and hospitals that were skeptical, we brought them on our side by actually describing what we were going to do in a great deal of detail and helping them come out and visit, see people, be able to work with them, and making sure they understood that the community treatment team option that we were putting together was being set up not so much as a travel agent, as many case management systems are, where they tell people where to go, but more as a travel companion, so that the case managers would be with people whenever they needed them, up to 24 hours a day. Believe it or not, we were able to keep that promise. Our case managers were indeed companions, and the caseloads were low enough, and I almost am embarrassed these days to say, for a team of 8 case managers only worked with a number of 10 clients. So we had an incredible ratio in the beginning to be able to make sure clients got the time where they lived or what they were doing to actually know that there was someone who was going to be there with them. It was a model that worked. We learned from it. We did have a couple of tragedies. And again, I go back to the governor and the secretary for having the political will not to stop the process because there were tragedies. And we were able to close the hospital in June of 1990, which was approximately, it was 2 years, but about 1.5 years after we started, with people living successfully in the community.
You know, as you described the work that went into closing the hospital, it sounds like, you built a movement. You truly built a movement. And I'm interested in hearing a little bit about how your work to close the Philadelphia State Hospital influenced some of the work that you went on to do. for those of us who serve in government, it is certainly a benefit to work alongside people who have had other lived experiences outside of government. To talk about how some of that work influenced the work that you did when you went into government, your work at the Pennsylvania Secretary of Public Welfare, your work serving as a senior advisor to the Secretary of HUD.
Well, that's a very good question. I left the state after just before the end of the closure, and all the activity of the closure moved with me as I became the mental health director for the city of Philadelphia. And I worked with who was then Mayor Rendell, and worked within the city of Philadelphia, building a mental health system, and particularly focused on housing supports and how we could take control of some of the dollars coming through Medicaid. At the end of that period, the mayor, 2 years later became governor, and that's when I followed him to Harrisburg. And the lessons we learned from the closure around support systems, community integration, and the ability to help people be part of their community served me well. But at that point, I began, obviously, because I'm now secretary not only of the state, but had both Medicaid, developmental disabilities, and child welfare within the umbrella agency. I was able to also think about, aren't there other populations, particularly the one that came to my mind was the nursing facilities population, who also should not be institutionalized. We had begun to integrate people with developmental disabilities. We wanted small housing. We know supports. We know the difference between people who live successfully in the community and people who are more troubled. It's a matter of how much support you can give. But one of my focuses at the state, which was very clearly built on my Philadelphia State Hospital experience, was beginning to get more people out of our nursing facilities into community living. And I would tell you, first, it was cost effective. So anytime you're at the state, you're looking for cost-effective mechanisms, and having people live in community and not in nursing facilities made sense. We were also successful in closing 3 more state hospitals and 2 more developmental centers. My focus near the end of that administration was beginning to look at the juvenile justice facilities. And I would tell you, probably needs a little bit more time for that, but was certainly able in many ways to bring to light some of the challenges within that particular system. And the only thing I can say is the problems we saw 10 years ago, 15 years ago, are now coming to light. We have a very troubled juvenile justice system, and many of that is falling back on people of color. So learning how and when to help people live in the community supports is very clearly, from my perspective, a pay me now or pay me later. The more we are able to invest now in having people live in the communities, the smaller our costs will be in the future when we have to pick up the pieces of what we didn't do.
Yeah. And we have a few questions that are trickling in that I'm going to try to get to during the course of the program, but I want to pivot to law enforcement and then bring Keris into the discussion. I would love to hear your views about the work that we need to do to address the ways in which law enforcement is used to respond to mental health calls. This is work that we're undertaking now at the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division. And so my question essentially is, does the use of law enforcement to respond to mental health calls play a role in continued needless institutionalization today?
Well, yes, it plays a role, and it plays a negative and bad role. People, the last people who should be responding to a mental health call are the police. They are not criminals. They are not bad. They didn't do something wrong. They have a neurological challenge. They have an illness, but they are not people who need to be dragged into a police station or dragged in handcuffs to a hospital. This criminalizes the behavior. It increases the probability that other people see them as done something wrong. So our context of painting people with mental illness together with the police, together with the criminal justice system, it's just taken us in totally the wrong direction. We have found that, and we found not only with the closure, but there are very many examples that I've seen over time that people in mental health crisis do respond to a mental health professional who's there to calm them down, to work with them, to talk with them, and to be able to get them to sometimes still under commitment every now and then, but often voluntarily to follow the directions that will take them to a safe environment faster, without the criminal intention, without the involvement of police, without the involvement of handcuffs and other demeaning and non-respectful activity. At times where we've had police trained, most of the time they tried to be observant, they tried to back off, they aren't threatening, but that is happening in way too few cases. We're seeing much more opportunity of people taking advantage of people with mental illness. And we all know that percentage of people with mental illness who are dangerous or violent is a very small percentage. And most people are looking for ways to be helped. They just have not been able to find it on their own. And it's our job to help them find that help without making them feel that they've done something wrong. This is a very strong topic for me now because I see way too many examples of where people have been shot or hurt or killed because the police don't understand mental illness.
Right. And then there's the racial impact. And it is probably fair to say that over reliance on law enforcement responses and needless institutionalization all have a heavier burden, a starker impact on Black and Brown people with disabilities. So maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of how these issues manifest at the intersection of race and disability rights.
Well, I think that what we've seen, and I think that goes back to the days when I was very active in the field, that many times more people that are Black and Brown are where the police are called. The police make an assumption that Black or Brown people are going to be more dangerous or more unpredictable, so they're harsher. The emergency room assumes that a Black man is going to be scarier. So they take much more extreme. They're more likely to end up in some type of shackle or some type of pre-institution type situations than their counterparts that are not Black or Brown. I think we've particularly seen this with young Black boys or very young adults. It's that the assumption is that they're going to be dangerous, and the assumption is that they need an institution to be able to handle their behaviors. And again, what we've done is make huge generalizations about this, but has caused the unreasonable increase in young Black men and Black and Brown people in general to be institutionalized when there's so many other alternatives to help them live in the community and to get the support they need in the community of their design. You know, one of the other strong things we learned with the closure is people, regardless of their type of mental illness, could tell us what they would respond to. They could tell us where they wanted to live. They could tell us what they wanted to do. We just had to listen. And I think the key that I learned through all of these years is listening. Doesn't cost anything. And it probably is more likely to change behavior and more likely to get positive results than anything else we could do.
Well, thank you for your advocacy and all of the work that you've done throughout the years, the many different hats that you've worn. I want to pivot now to Keris. Thank you for your patience. I want to bring you into the conversation. You've spent many, many years as a mental health advocate, and you've also served in a number of key government roles. And all of this work has done a lot to advance the field of peer support, which we haven't really dug into yet. And so I want to ask you to talk about why peer support is so critical in the course of this work and the role that it plays in facilitating compliance with the integration mandate and with Olmstead.
Sure. So thank you very much for having me on the panel as well and speaking today on this very important anniversary of Olmstead. So first, I'd like to start off with the SAMHSA definition of peer support so everybody's clear about exactly what it is. And SAMHSA defines peer support as encompassing a range of activities and interactions between people who share similar experiences of being diagnosed with a mental health condition or a substance use disorder or both. And what it does is it creates mutuality between the peer supporter and the person they're serving to promote connection and inspire hope. So they offer levels of acceptance, understanding, and validation. It's really not found in many other professional relationships, like with your psychiatrist or social worker or psychologist. And what we do is we share our own lived experience and practical guidance, and peer support workers help people to develop their own goals, create strategies for self-empowerment, and take concrete steps towards building and fulfilling self-determined lives for themselves. So, we inspire hope that people can and do recover. And we walk with people on their recovery journeys. I think Estelle was talking about, the case managers who were there 24/7. Peers can also be like that case manager, but we don't really manage cases. We support people, and we can do that, as they are living, working, and playing in the community. The other thing is we dispel myths about what it means to have a mental health condition or substance use disorder. We provide self-help education and link people to tools and resources. And we support people in identifying, again, their goals, hopes, and dreams, and help them to create that roadmap for getting there. So I like to think of the story of a person who's in a hole, and everybody's, at the top of this big hole looking down at the person in the hole and saying, here's how we can help you, here's how we can help you. But unfortunately, that person is still in the bottom of this deep, dark hole. Another person decides to jump in or climb into the hole. And the first person in the hole asks angrily, hey, what'd you jump in here for? Now we're both stuck down here. But the second person is a peer and they say, I was here before and I know the way out. And that's, I think, a great example, very easy example of remembering the importance of a peer. So as far as when we think about compliance and the mandate, I think peers, promote leadership and advocacy within the behavioral health programs to advance recovery-oriented mission of the services. These are core competencies that we learn when we become peer supporters. We use the knowledge of relevant rights and laws such as ADA, HIPAA, and Olmstead to ensure that a person's rights are respected and that they know what their rights are. We advocate for the needs and desires of people in treatment and team meetings and community services, living situations, and also we can support with families. And we use our knowledge of legal resources and advocacy organizations to build an advocacy plan. We also participate in efforts to eliminate prejudice and discrimination of people who have behavioral health conditions, and of course, educating our colleagues about the process of recovery and the use of recovery support services.
I love the hole, jumping into a hole, that analogy that you laid out to help us really underscore and understand why peer support is so critical in this space. Would love to ask you to talk a little bit more about how you came to really focus and hone in on peer support.
Yeah, so peer support for me was really helpful in my own recovery as well as many others. And my interest and passion is in increasing access, especially to a diverse peer workforce who can support those in most need, particularly peers of color. When I was working through my own recovery process, which I didn't even know it really was a recovery process, especially in public mental health, I saw a lot of people in what is called the consumer, survivor, ex-patient, and peer movement talking about their recovery and recovery journeys, but I didn't see many people who looked like me. I didn't see Black and Brown people up on stages or leading workshops. So I actually had to ask a leading peer advocate, Dr. Ron Bassman, about where are there peers who look like me, because he had written an article about the next wave of the peer movement. And I said, hey, where are people who look like me? I don't believe recovery is possible because I don't see peers in leadership who are Black and Brown. And he introduced me to Miss Jackie McKinney, who recently passed away. And Jackie then introduced me to Celia Brown and Kathy Cave and Carlton Whitmore. I'm going to name names and I'm going to miss a lot of names, but I think it's important for us to know there's so many people of color who are out there, Chakuma Tai, Wilma Townsend, et cetera. And once I saw that it was possible, that's what led me to really, really focus on peer support. Also, because we continue to have difficulty advancing peer support, concerned me enough to contribute to the literature and being able to describe it to the public and also to academicians and policymakers and legislators to create tools and resources in order to do our advocacy, and also to help the public have a better understanding of mental health recovery, and the role of peer supporters. While I was at SAMHSA, engaged in peer workforce efforts in the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health as the chief of peer and allied health professions, it was important to think about and continue to help the public sector understand, well, what is this peer support and how can we have more of it? Because it really does ensure and help people to move forward into their recovery. So I think those are some of the reasons why I really got involved and remain involved.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing your personal story, your personal testimony about the power of peer support. It's probably fair to say that there's more work that we need to do to integrate the use of peer support in our disability service system. So for some of the advocates and folks who are with us today, why don't you take a moment to just outline some of the strategies that we can use to really truly expand use of peer support as a tool here?
Sure. So I think, first of all, one of the easiest, well, I say it's easy. I don't know how easy it is, but it should be easy because it makes most logical sense, is to remove systemic barriers such as policies which limit the expanded use of peers. So for example, there may be hiring criteria related to criminal justice involvement or educational level attainment that may inhibit people who do this work really, really well of not being able to be involved. For trying to reduce criminal justice involvement of people who are currently involved in criminal injustice systems, what better way than to have somebody who's been involved and gotten through to be able to support you to get through. But if you have a background on your record, criminal justice involvement on your record, you may not be able to get hired, but that's the very person that we need. Educational level attainment, you need a high school diploma or some kind of equivalency in order to become a certified peer support specialist according to Medicaid. How do we know what that equivalency is? Because many people, start to have mental health troubles during high school and may not finish their high school diploma. We also need to pay living wage and create career ladders for peers. Nothing worse than coming into the work and not being able to move up into positions of leadership and also get a living wage. We need to help assist our leaders in understanding the role of peer support to ensure our work can yield the evidence-based outcomes when practiced according to our values and practices. And then also we need to ensure that there is clear guidance about peer support roles and services in Medicare, Medicaid, and particularly in private insurance. People do move off of disability and into the private sector, and peers are not widely used in the private sector, but should be. I think, being able to create that opportunity would be very helpful.
I'd asked Estelle earlier to talk about the ways in which over-reliance on law enforcement when it comes to people with psychiatric disabilities can lead to needless institutionalization and over-incarceration. And I want to come back to this. I know that you have a powerful personal story to share, and wondered if you would talk with us about your own experience with police responders when you had a mental health crisis situation.
Sure. I wasn't doing well. I was really struggling, let's just put it that way. And my psychiatrist thought that, somebody needed to come in and check on me. I was living in my own apartment at the time, in a very small apartment building. There were not that many residents in this particular apartment building. And I was actually the only Black resident in this small apartment building. So I wasn't doing well, and I was told that somebody was going to come and check on me. And quite frankly, I thought it was going to be an ambulance, because I've been told a mental health condition is just like any other health condition. And when you have a crisis or a health emergency, it's generally an ambulance or an EMT that comes. But to my surprise, it was police who showed up in a police car in full uniform, knocking very loudly at my door so all the neighbors could hear, as they were trying to gain entrance into my house. I already have a natural fear. I think many people kind of fear law enforcement. You know, you see somebody driving behind you and, you know, it's a police car, you're going to stiffen up. But for, you know, as a Black person, because the outcomes of Black folks who have any kind of law enforcement involvement generally does not yield a good outcome, I became very fearful of letting them into my house. And I also became very fearful of what my neighbors would think. Here the police are, full uniforms, loudly proclaiming that they are the police. They're here at my door. And I was worried that my neighbors would come to some stereotypical belief about Black people and or think that somehow I had committed some kind of crime. I was handcuffed by the police. I was taken to a police station. I was handcuffed to a chair in a police station while they took care of other issues that were happening in the station. And they kept telling me the whole time they had me because I was not well, that I was mentally ill, that I had an illness. And I mean, that's very cognitive dissonance, is to be told you have an illness while you're handcuffed to a chair. It just doesn't seem to kind of make sense in one's mind, and at a time when you're so vulnerable and needing help, to have that happen. But I actually ended up being tackled at the hospital because, again, I was not clear about what was happening, why things were happening. There was nothing being explained to me. The police were still present. I had my belongings ripped from me along with my disability. I was 5-point restraint and forcibly medicated. But the involvement of the police for me increased the shame and stigma. It increased a worry about my own safety as a Black person, as well as trauma. And then actually it was refusal to accept, I don't want to say to accept the diagnosis that I was given, but I certainly didn't understand it any longer. And it was very, very hard for me to seek further help, especially further help when I probably could have used some crisis support. So my future hospitalizations after that incident actually continued to be police or involuntary hospitalizations.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. And I'm sorry to hear about what you experienced, but hope that your testimony helps to empower others and helps to encourage that our audience kind of understand what's truly at stake for people. You talked about how your experience as a Black woman made you feel particularly vulnerable when the police showed up at your door, and how you were treated at the police station. I wondered if you could talk about the effects of our mental health system failures and how they compound problems for Black and Brown people who have disabilities.
So we hear the term representation matters, and I could scream that from the mountaintop. Let's just put it that way. Representation really does matter. When we don't have access to providers and peers who look like us or speak the same languages, our needs are not fully understood, especially within a cultural context. We have to do code switching. Who has time to do code switching when you're not doing well? I want to speak like I need to speak rather than try to code switch into quote unquote King James English, if you will, in order to be understood. It's easier if you're speaking to someone who looks like you can understand you. We also fail to disaggregate data often by race and ethnicity. So we may not know if our work is exacerbating disparities or moving more towards equitable and just systems of care. So we have seen certain practices or programs claim improvements on incarceration or reducing harm within crisis response, but we see large numbers, we see big data. We don't see how that data is disaggregated to see whether or not there are existing disparities for people of color or BIPOC communities. And I have asked actually, well, can you disaggregate the data? And when it's disaggregated for some of these very well-known programs, we find indeed that the disparities continue for Black and Brown communities. And also the choice of community means more than merely housing and where we live, but it's all about fully participating in a community in which we live, work, and play. And that may be culturally and linguistically bound to support the whole person. So when we're forced to live in particular communities, even though that may be considered least restrictive, but there's a force component to it coming from the court, that doesn't help us live in the communities in which we can fully flourish from a cultural and linguistic standpoint.
Yeah. You know, the tragic death of George Floyd, the tragic killing of George Floyd, I think he's opened up a very robust conversation across our country about constitutional policing, more effective policing, fair policing, and public safety. How do we ensure public safety? So I guess a question that I have for you as we round out this part of our conversation is what do you think we need to do differently with respect to how we deploy law enforcement to respond to calls involving people with psychiatric disabilities, particularly given your own lived experience?
So I will say that I don't believe law enforcement has a place in a mental health crisis response. That the role of law enforcement, however, is a default mental health emergency response is really a systemic issue that we have to be aware of and is based largely at the local level jurisdictions. So unfortunately, law enforcement response has caused trauma and harm, including death. And even with co-responder models, there seems to be an increase in the use of institutionalization, whether it be involuntary treatment, could be 72-hour treatment, et cetera, rather than when we use mobile teams, et cetera, that do not have law enforcement involved, where people are usually helped and the crisis is resolved in the community, and or use of things like peer respites help not have to use those really coercive forces. So use of peers as crisis responders on mobile teams has proven to be effective, and peers have the ability to engage people in crisis in what we call rapid engagement because of mutuality, patience, the ability to understand how to navigate the various systems. These systems many times are not connected and people fall through the gaps. Sometimes I call these gaps chasms, but because we have been on that road and traveled that journey, we have a better sense of how to evade, if you will, or how to walk around that particular gap and not fall into the chasm. We have time for empathy. And one of the things we're very good at is activation. Engagement is one thing. The other thing is helping people be activated and participate in their own care and supports. The other thing is, this can help reduce high-cost hospitalization and ER services, those trans-institutionalization concerns, reduces stigma. We also help increase tenure in the community. So if the goal is to reduce crisis, one of the ways to do that, again, is to have a robust peer support, peers as part of mobile teams in order to increase that tenure in the community. Also, we help increase participation via shared decision-making in treatment and other services. So do I see law enforcement having a role? No, but I do see peers having a very big role in which at this point, they have not been highly utilized.
So I want to bring Estelle back. I got a question for both of you about the vision, the road ahead. So we've made great progress, but here we are in 2022, and I'd love to hear the both of you. Let's start with Estelle. Talk about your vision for the future. Where would you like to see Olmstead enforcement efforts kind of focus on in the road ahead and in the years ahead?
During my years at HUD, one of the connections that I was able to make is a stronger connection between HUD and HHS, particularly SAMHSA and CMS, the Center for Medicaid Services. And with the help of DOJ civil rights, we were able to try to help states understand housing. You know, frequently when we go into to look at they're focused very heavily on the mental health component. And the biggest barrier is housing. And I believe that housing is the key in making sure that people understand how housing works, to make sure that people who are in institutions get a leg up and have a priority within our public housing system, and that we make sure that the supports are there. So HUD provides the housing and gets people a leg up on that housing. SAMHSA and CMS provides the services and supports for them. We need to do this in partnership, and DOJ and the ADA need to enforce it. The second one was peer supports. You know, while in my day, we used case management for that. I think Keris is right. It's now peer supports. They can do this. They should be paid a willing wage, because people just don't need treatment of professionals. They need friends. They need peers. They need supports that live with them in the community. And that's what the peer supports do. And the last thing for me is people need something meaningful to do during the day. And the ADA and Olmstead need to work not only to keep people out of institutions, but to also make sure that people have a place to live, they have things to do, and those things are age appropriate.
And I'll follow up on the peer support. I think we've nailed peer support, and I don't want to leave out family, parent, caregiver, who also need support and resources to navigate the various systems for full integration as well. I think we've talked about ensuring housing and housing first is funded and available. And lastly, to eliminate use of coercion and fully invest, advance, and support cultural and linguistic relevant services and supports where people live, work, and play, especially for people who are in most need and are underserved, unserved, or inappropriately served.
You know, a few of our participants have expressed gratitude to the both of you for talking about your work, your experience, your personal testimony about these issues. And I want to reiterate my gratitude. I have so appreciated this time that we have had together today. I thank you for your wisdom. I thank you for all that you've given us to work with, and the inspiration that you provide as we continue to work to ensure robust implementation of the integration mandate in all of its forms as we move forward. So thank you both for being with us today, and happy anniversary to Olmstead. And thank you to all of the participants who are with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Take care.